everyone, Brady from Texturelabs.org here, and in this tutorial we're going to get into 3D. And as you guys know, most 3D work you see out there is done using Cinema 4D, Maya, Blender, incredible programs, but there's actually a whole lot you can do right here in Photoshop. So all of these images were created using the same technique we're going to check out in this tutorial, and it won't be an exhaustive exploration of the 3D workspace. I actually like to keep it relatively simple on the 3D side, and then use all the traditional Photoshop tools we have to help build up to a finished image. Let's jump into Photoshop and check it out. Alright, I'm getting started here with a Photoshop document. This is HD, resolution 1920 by 1080. I'd recommend that as sort of the minimum size. I'm often working at double this size, but we'll keep it simple here at HD, and I've got a few layers of live type in here. So Photoshop will let you turn any layer into an extruded 3D shape, but to get really clean results, you're going to want to use either live type layers or shape layers. So both of these are layers that can be scaled way up, rotated. Whatever you do here, they preserve all their detail because they're not based on pixels, but rather on mathematical calculations. So these are obviously both live type layers, but I'm actually going to right click on this larger text and select Convert to Shape. So while live type has the advantage of keeping your type live, there's another thing I really like about shape layers, and if I hit P for the pen tool, I can see the options for the shape layer up here, and I can control the fill color of this layer, but also the stroke. So let me make this stroke red, we can really see it, and I'll crank up the size a bit. So with a live type layer, there's really no option to create an outline like this, where you get these really nice, clean corners. And when it comes to creating some really exaggerated 3D typography, I actually like to create an entirely separate layer just for this outer stroke. So I'm going to use Command or Control J to make a duplicate of this layer. I'll rename the bottom one Fill, and I'll call the top one Stroke. Then let me turn the top one off for now, and on the fill layer, I'll click on the stroke color and use this first little option to totally eliminate the stroke. Then on the top layer, I'll do the opposite. I'll select the fill color and X that out. And it doesn't really matter what the color of the stroke is here, but let me adjust the size of it a little bit. And then in this little drop down, I even have control over how the stroke is generated. If I set this align feature to the last option, that'll push the stroke to be on the outside of the shapes. Alright, so I've got two shape layers, a fill and a stroke, and then this live type layer. I'll rename this one Subtitle. Doesn't really make sense, but I just need some way to refer to it for this tutorial. Alright, well let's take this into 3D. In the window menu here, I'm going to open the 3D panel. And by default, I already have the Properties tab open. You may need to open that as well. But the 3D and the Properties panels are going to be the main control panels. So I like to kind of stick them together here while I'm working. Let's select this subtitle layer on top first, and in the 3D panel, I've got Create New 3D Object. I'm going to select 3D Extrusion and hit Create. So you can see that got me started with these extruded letters, and I'm looking at this 3D workspace of grids and arrows and all kinds of stuff. Most of this is for moving objects and cameras around in the 3D workspace. These controls are really only visible as long as I have the Move tool selected. For the moment, I'm not actually interested in moving things around, so I'm just going to hit M for the marquee tool so I don't accidentally move anything and just to kind of get that stuff out of the way. So what we're looking at here is actually an unrendered preview of what the final 3D will look like. At any time I can hit this render button down here and Photoshop will start to process a final render. You can hit escape at any time to stop that, and I can even drag a selection around a small area if I want a quick preview. So in the 3D panel, this is kind of the list of all the items I can manipulate in the 3D scene. I've got this subtitle object selected, and in the Properties panel I can choose a shape preset to start to customize this shape. This second preset is actually a nice standard beveled 3D shape. Then I can customize that a bit, bringing the extrusion depth to be a little bit shallower here. And then in this third section over, the cap section, I can change the bevel width. Maybe I'll drag that up a bit and make it a little bit more dramatic. Alright, that's kind of a nice jumping off point. Let's do the same thing for these other layers. I'll take the fill layer and also create a 3D extrusion. I'm going to select that same shape preset here to give me some beveled edges on that. And I'm going to drag the extrusion depth way down here. This is just going to be the fill of the letters, so I don't need much of the sides on this. I'm also going to go to the cap section and bring the width of the bevel down, make this a little bit more of a subtle bevel. Alright, let's leave that there for now. And then I'm going to do the same thing with this stroke layer. Create a 3D extrusion. And I'm not worrying about the fact that these objects are kind of blocking each other and not really living in the same space. That'll get solved in a moment. For now, I'm going to use that same shape preset to give it a beveled edge, and then I'm going to adjust the extrusion depth kind of just by eye. We can always come back and adjust this, but get it to where it's looking like the letters are about the right depth. All right, in the cap section, I'm going to bring up the width here. Because this is such a narrow object, I need a higher percentage of it to be beveled just so we can see that bevel. All right, well, we've got the 3 of these 3D objects kind of roughed in. What I'm going to do next is hold Shift and select all 3 of these layers. Then up here in the 3D menu, I'm going to select Merge 3D Layers. And that put all 3 of those 3D objects into a single environment on a single layer, but it also does something strange. Maybe this is a bug. Photoshop decided maybe it would put everything way up here. That's no problem. What I'm going to do is hit V for the Move tool and get all those controllers back. And in the 3D panel, I can collapse down some of these open hierarchies. These items with the star next to them are the 3D objects. And I can hold Command on a Mac or in Windows hold Control and click to select all 3 of these. And then I can use the arrows here to drag these down and back into the center. I can also select these one at a time and move them, but I do want to be careful not to misalign the fill and stroke objects. All right, and while we're in move mode, let's make one change to this scene. I'm going to select current view, and this is where we can change the attributes of the camera. So let me change the field of view to be a 20mm lens. That's a wider lens and gives us more exaggerated perspective. It also means we need the camera to be a little closer to the objects, so up here in the tool options, I'm going to select the 4th little controller here, slide the 3D camera, and dragging that around will kind of slide things all over the place, but if I hold Shift, it'll constrain that movement to just the Z axis, meaning I can zoom straight in and out and get that framed up. All right, while we're here, let's go back to that first option up here, roll the 3D camera, and also holding Shift, I'm just going to drag that up and give the whole scene a slightly more epic perspective. All right, it's incredibly easy here to click on the wrong thing and lose your camera angle. So in the camera options, I can actually quickly save this view. I'll just call it My View. And sometimes it's nice to actually move the camera around and get a look at your geometry, and you can always come back to this saved view. Actually, when I really get in here, I may want to select this stroke object and move it just a little bit to line these up. And then I can go back to my saved view. All right, I'm going to hit M for the marquee tool so I don't accidentally move things any further. Let's give this a quick render to see how things are looking. All right, well, the geometry looks good, but next we'll need to work on the texturing and the lighting, and those two things kind of work in harmony, so we'll dial them in together. In the 3D panel, the 3rd section here will highlight just the materials in your scene. Each of these objects has 5 materials: the front inflation material, the front bevel material, the extrusion material, the back bevel material, and the back inflation material. So there's no place in this image where I can even see the back bevel or the back inflation material. I'm just going to turn those materials off. You don't necessarily have to do that, but I like to turn them off so I know I don't have to worry about them. The same goes for the extrusion material on the fill object. The sides of that object are hiding, so the material doesn't really make a difference. Now, if I select one of the materials on this subtitle, which remember was created with live type, it's got a bunch of properties, one of them being the base color, which is white. But if I select one of the materials on the other objects that were created using shape layers, this little folder icon next to the base color looks different, meaning Photoshop is using a file for the color of this object. And that's why we're seeing this weird double image in here. What Photoshop has done, which we don't want, is that it automatically created a texture based on what the original layer looked like. So it's mapping the original flat layer onto the color property of this object. And that's going to be the case for any of these materials on objects that were created using shape layers. So I can actually shift select all of these materials and make a change to all of them simultaneously. In the drop down under this little folder, I'm going to select Remove Texture. And that resets the base color of these objects to a default 50% gray. I'll do a quick test render, and there we go, nice and simple, and we can kind of customize things from here. So there are a lot of different properties to these materials. The only ones I'm going to worry about are base color, which is your color, metallic, which used to be called reflections, and I think that made more sense, and roughness, which you can kind of think of as reflection blur. So I'm going to select a handful of these materials. I'm going to grab everything from the stroke object and the subtitle object, and I'll change the color here to something of a dark gold color with the hue at 50, saturation at 100, and the brightness at 30. And sometimes when you hit OK, it either deselects all the materials or selects all of them. Kind of a little bug, and you just need to reselect those materials. Let's also take the metallic value or the reflectiveness all the way up to 100 and give that a quick render. And that'll make a decent jumping off point. Let me select both of the active materials on the fill object, and I'll make these a pretty bright saturated red. Give it a quick test render. That's a decent start. Let's shift over to working on the lighting a little bit, since the materials on the lighting really do work in tandem with each other. So in the 3D panel, there's this light bulb or lighting section, and there are two elements lighting the scene by default. The simple one is this infinite light. And if I hit V for the move tool, you can see this is just a light source, kind of like sunlight beaming down in one direction. You could drag and change the angle, although the default angle works pretty well coming from the top here. All right, also in the lighting section is environment, and environment includes a few things. First is this global ambient light, which maybe this is left over from an old version of Photoshop. As far as I can tell, it doesn't do anything at all. All right, then you've got IBL or image-based lighting. This section is awesome. If I hit the move tool, image-based lighting is this invisible sphere that surrounds your entire scene, and it both illuminates the scene and also it's going to show up in reflections. The environment section also has this ground plane section. This is if you want to cast shadow on the ground or to create a reflection. I don't want either of those, so I'm going to bring the opacity to 0. So IBL is the only section we're going to use here. I'm going to turn off the infinite light and crank up the intensity a little bit, and we'll do a quick render to see what this image-based lighting is doing. All right, so it's kind of a flat, but also a very natural light. And what's missing here is that the image it's using for image-based lighting is just white. So it's kind of a big blob of a white sphere lighting everything. But if I go to the drop down here and select new texture, I'm going to make this new texture a square, 1024 by 1024 pixels with a white background. So that put in a new texture, just a solid white. For some reason, it's a lot more intense than the original white, so I'll bring the intensity down. And what I'm going to do is select Edit Texture. And that takes us to this new file. This is the environment. Let's make it a bit more interesting. I'll hit D to set my colors to default. Then under Filter, Render, I'll use Clouds to create some shapes. Then I'm going to hit X to reverse the foreground and background colors. And in the Filter menu, I'm going to use Filter Gallery. And here I'm going to use the photocopy filter. And that'll just make the whole thing a little more crunchy with both of these values at 20. All right, then all I have to do is hit save on this file, and back in the main document, you can already see some more interesting things going on here. If I hit V for the move tool, I can rotate that environment and you can really get a sense of what it's adding to the scene. I'm going to do a quick render, and you can see we have some nice reflections coming from that environment. If I turn back on the infinite light and try that, then I can start to find a balance between those two lights. I'm going to bring the intensity of the infinite light down to 50%, and mostly use this image-based lighting. I'll bring that up to 150%. All right, so with the lighting and reflections a little bit more worked out, I can come back to the materials and really dial those in. You can really get a whole lot of variation here just by adjusting these metallic and roughness properties. So if I select all the materials that are this gold color and take the roughness to 0 and try a quick render on that, we get these really high contrast reflections. Definitely kind of cool, but too much in some places. So why don't I take the materials on this subtitle object and bring the roughness to 40%. And I like these super sharp reflections on the stroke object down here. Maybe they're a bit too much. I'll take the roughness on those up to 15%. Then I like to make a decision about whether the faces or the extrusions are going to be more dominant in the image and dial one or the other back. So why don't I take both of the extrusion materials and bring the metallic property down to 60%. I think that makes the whole thing just a little bit easier on the eyes. All right, finally, let's dial in the materials on this fill object. I'm going to select both of those and bring the metallic value up to 65%, make it a little bit more shiny, and I'll bring the roughness down to 10%. Then just on this bevel, let's make the color a little bit darker red, and that'll give the faces just a little bit of contrast. All right, I'm going to try a render on that, and I can make any final adjustments now. I can even come back to some of the original modeling, and I'm going to make this subtitle text not quite so extruded. And check this out. I want to make this stroke shape a little bit wider. With that object selected, I can come all the way down here to Edit Source. And if I hit that, Photoshop actually automatically makes a smart object anytime you bring something into 3D. So this will take me back to the original shape layer. And here I can bring the stroke value up a little bit. And if I save that, then it automatically updates that shape in the main document. All right, let's do a final render on that and just let that one finish. Not the fastest process. That could be anywhere from 1 to 10, 15 minutes. But when that's done, we've got a nice clean render. But at this point, if you accidentally change any value here, you're going to lose that render. So the first thing I'm going to do is use Command or Control J to make a duplicate of that layer, then right click and select Rasterize 3D, and that flattens it into a regular layer. So really the fun part here is the compositing, all the regular Photoshop treatment we can do to this flattened 3D. And of course, you could jump right into adding adjustment layers and things here. I'm going to do one more thing while we're still in 3D that's going to really help us out when it comes to the compositing. I'm going to create a few black and white mattes that we can use as layer masks. So let me turn off this rendered copy and make a new copy of the live 3D. I'll call it mattes. And here in the main 3D properties tab, I'm going to select the scene settings and change the style of this render to unlit texture. So you can see when I hit render, that just sends out a flat image based on whatever the base color of these materials are. So I'm going to select both of the materials on this fill object and make them black, then all the materials on the stroke and subtitle objects and make those white. Then I'm going to hit render, and that goes really fast. And this is actually the only thing I need to make separate mattes for all three of these elements. So I'm going to right click on that layer and use Rasterize 3D. Then let me reset my workspace here since we're pretty much done with the 3D. All right, I'm going to select all on this mattes layer and copy that. Then I'll turn this layer off, turn off my backup live 3D layer, and turn back on this original render. I'm going to create a levels adjustment layer. I'm going to hold the Option or the Alt key and click on that mask to edit it directly. And here I'll use Command or Control Shift V to paste that in place. That'll paste it into the exact spot where I copied it. Then Command or Control D to deselect, and I'm going to use Command or Control I to invert the mask. And if I exit mask view mode, now that levels adjustment layer is just targeting the faces. Let's make another levels adjustment layer, then Option or Alt click to get into mask view mode. And here, first I will use Command or Control I to invert the mask, then Command or Control Shift V to paste that same image into the mask. I'll deselect and exit the mask, and now this adjustment layer will only affect the stroke and the subtitle text on top. I might even separate those two by duplicating this adjustment layer, and using the marquee tool, I'll drag a selection around this area on top and fill that with black. Then I can invert the selection using Command or Control Shift I. I'll select the other mask and fill this one with black. So now I have a levels adjustment layer for each of these elements, and I can kind of dial in the brightness and contrast of all of them much more quickly and in a more targeted way than I could by making adjustments to the materials in the 3D workspace. I can also Command or Control click on any of these masks to make a selection in that shape, then create any other kinds of adjustment layers, maybe a hue saturation adjustment layer to change the color of this extrusion a little bit. I'm going to actually do the same thing for this subtitle text on top. And in addition to that, if I want to introduce some texture into these letters, I'm going to grab kind of a grungy texture here. This is a free texture from Texturelabs.org. Everything on the site is free, so be sure to check that out. Let me paste that in here, and then Command or Control click on one of these masks, hit the Create Mask button, and get that texture to live just in those specific areas. I'm going to set that to overlay mode, and then I can click on the little unlink mask option and use Command or Control T to transform and move that around to find a good spot and give those sections some grungy texture. Then that texture and the levels adjustment layer can work together to give those sections a more finished look. Let me grab another texture. I'll copy that and paste it in here. Then Command or Control click on the mask for the fill shape. Create a mask for that one. Then maybe I'll try a different blending mode. Vivid light is kind of cool here. Vivid light, by the way, is a blending mode that looks better when you bring back the fill rather than the opacity. And I can unlink that from the mask and move it around. This really is kind of the fun part where you can just experiment. So I'm going to grab one more texture here, make a copy of that, paste it in, and use the mask for this subtitle text on top, and I'll set that one to overlay. All right, well, let's get into some proper photoshopping and get some little lens flares in here. I'm going to copy this nice little streak lens flare. I'll put it in there and set it to screen mode, then scale that down. I think it looks cool if these little light streaks kind of line up with the bright spots on the edges. I'm actually going to use Command or Control J to make a few copies of that and just move them around to a few different spots. It's pretty over the top, but there's something about it that just looks so good. All right, let's get another element in here. This is kind of a cool lens artifact. I will copy and paste that in here and set it to screen mode. Then maybe I'll rotate it and stretch it way out. Just kind of experimenting here. I'm gonna see if I can make it look like a light streak. I can use Command or Control U to make a hue saturation adjustment, and I'll turn that maybe a little bit more red and bring back the lightness. And I'm gonna make a copy of that one. Maybe I'll move it over and scale this one up, bring back the opacity a bit. And I actually really liked how it looked right when I pasted that in here. Let me paste another one in. There's something cool about this giant blue blob of light. And maybe at this point it feels a bit less like a tutorial and more like me just messing around in Photoshop, but that's kind of how compositing works. There's no magic formula. If there's a formula at all, it's just to experiment. There's no shame in bringing in some stock elements and textures to layer up. That's part of what I've tried to provide you guys with Texturelabs.org. So you can kind of just take your time and start to build up a final look. I'm going to drop one more element in here for sort of an environment. I've got some drifting embers that can go in the background. Maybe I'll make a hue saturation adjustment on those, and then make a copy and put another copy all the way at the top, maybe rotate it 180 degrees, set that to screen, and then maybe adjust the hue saturation on that one as well. And once the whole image is more or less dialed in, if you watch this channel, you know that I almost always make a merged copy of the entire image using that crazy shortcut Command-Option-Shift-E or Control-Alt-Shift-E, and then use Filter, Camera Raw Filter, and make some final adjustments to kind of glue the image together. So maybe a bit more contrast and dial in the black and white values. I think I'll bring down the vibrance a little bit. This is definitely just a place to experiment. I like to do a little bit of sharpening here and just see what I can do to balance out the finished image. A little grain is always nice. All right, well, one of the most difficult things in Photoshop is deciding when you're done, but let's call that a finished image. All right, well, I hope you guys have enjoyed this tutorial and that it will help you to create something. Please do hit that like button and leave me a comment. Let me know if you have any questions. Thank you to the Texturelabs.org Patreon supporters, and thank you for watching. I'll see you next time.